Hey, Foundry Groups, we are on the other side of Thanksgiving now. Cannot believe it. So if your tree is not up, no excuses to drop everything you're doing and get that Christmas tree up. We are in full stage Christmas now. But before we jump into that, speaking of Thanksgiving, I want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart for how groups responded to the Thanksgiving baskets with Harvest Stand. I actually just got the total of the amount of pounds we did, and we beat last year's record, and we brought in over 3,530 pounds worth of Thanksgiving stuff. So thank you guys for responding as groups. We had 3 groups that were over 8 baskets. So for those groups, I'll be reaching out with your prize here shortly. But thank you for really anytime we ask you guys to step into something, you do and you respond well. So thank you from not only from the Foundry Church, but the Zealand community for putting Thanksgiving on people's tables who need it most. So thank you guys for doing that. As we look to this next series, this new series we're jumping into now, we have our eyes on Christmas, and our eyes are on Jesus' birth. And from the course of this year so far, we've really been diving into the Bible, and throughout it we hear echoes of who Jesus might be, the Messiah, what this is going to look like, who this is going to look like. And over the course of this series, we're going to be answering some of those questions, the who, the what, the where, the when. It's this mystery style, and I'm so excited for it. But this week, we look specifically at the who Jesus was going to be and who he was going to come out of. And often we see this in 2 of the Gospels specifically, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are our 4 Gospels. In 2 of those, we see the book start out with genealogies. And so often when I've read the Gospels, I skip over those and jump right into the story. That's natural for us to do. But there's so much power out of those genealogies. In those genealogies, we see stories of people who we've read throughout the course of this year. We see patriarchs like David being in those genealogies, but we also see like Tamar is in some of those genealogies, and she's got a pretty dark past, and a past that you would think would not want to be included in the line of Jesus. But what we know is that he came out of people specifically and for a reason. And out of the course of this last week, Eric pointed to this idea that God has a plan regardless of a few different things, right? Overall, God has a plan regardless of your past, regardless of your family history, regardless of if you don't feel like he's on the move. Like, God still has a plan, and God is still in control. Even if you've got personal failures, right? Some of the people in Jesus's genealogy had failures. They had major upsets in their life, and yet God used their lives for a bigger purpose. So I hope you heard that in the who, God can still work and God still has a plan. So let's jump right into groups content. Today I want to start out with the icebreaker question, and it is this: what is the best mystery you ever watched or read? And for me, I think back to as a child, I loved the Boxcar Children. I could just engulf those books and just read those day in, day out. So what is your favorite mystery, whether you watched it or read it? All right, groups, I want everyone to raise their hand a minute. All right, the last person that raised their hand has to read this next section. So I'm sorry, if you participated sooner with me, you won't need to do this. But for those people, I want you to read Matthew 1 through 16, and it's a genealogy. And there's going to be names in there that are hard, but live into it. And as you guys are reading, actually pay attention, because often we want to just gloss over this part, but pay attention. See if there's names that you recognize that we have already gone through their stories. So read that, and then we'll jump into a few questions. All right, here's the questions out of this. And be honest, do you usually read the genealogies that you see in the Bible? All right, I want everyone to raise their hands again. And everyone's floods up. Don't worry, I'm not going to have you read anything. But I want you to actually look at the book of Luke, because there's also a genealogy in that gospel. Now look through that. You can just even do that on your own. You don't need to read it out loud. But see once if there's any differences that you can note. And are you surprised that there are differences? What stands out to you about Luke's genealogy, and why is that? All right, we're going to quick read from Hebrews 11, verse 8. It says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going." I love when the New Testament actually echoes back to stories we've heard and read quite a while ago, back to Abraham. And we know that God has a plan for Abraham, but Abraham didn't understand all that God was doing. How can this help you when you think about this story? How can this help you in your walk with God? Let's be honest here. Do you ever feel that certain things in your past or certain things in your family tree prevent you by being used in God's plans? Do you think that disqualifies you from God being able to use you? In Pastor Eric's message this week, he notes a few specific stories, and I want to remake a note of them today before we jump into the next question. We've got the story in the genealogy of Tamar, who was widowed twice, left to be alone, eventually carrying her father-in-law's child. Right, yeah, there's enough said there. Rahab, a prostitute who also hid spies in Jericho. Ruth, an immigrant who was widowed and super poor. You have Uriah, a man who was murdered to cover up King David's adultery with his wife. Though not in Christ's line himself, God would not let his name be forgotten. When we look at all these stories, which of these four stories stood out to you and why? And what can you learn about God through that story? In the message, we heard that God has a plan despite our personal failures. Why do you either agree or disagree with that statement? This next question is so fascinating for me because I think we live in such a culture who want things going on, even if we're an introvert, right? That we turn on the TV on the background, that we pop our headphones in, that we've got music going on in the background. We jump in the car, we immediately turn the radio up, and we never have silence, right? When is the last time you were in complete silence and didn't have any noise around you from the world, from the culture, radio, TV, earbuds, any of those things? When was the last time you were silent? Describe a time when you were praying about something and only heard silence from God. If you were faced with a moment like that, what did you do? Does it comfort you to see that God had a plan, even though at the end of the Old Testament we see this 400 years of silence there, that God wasn't speaking to the prophets and the prophets weren't speaking to the people? The question is this: does it comfort you to see that God still has a plan even though there was that silence? And as we end today, one of my favorite parts about my group specifically is being able to not only live life together, but if somebody's having a hard time, to hear a testimony from somebody else who has lived through either a similar situation or a similar experience. So I want to take some time. Does anyone have a testimony about waiting on God that could encourage the rest of the group? Has there been a time where you've waited and I'm going to be honest, it's hard when you're waiting on God, right? Because we live in a culture that wants to move and want to make things happen. But do you have a testimony where you have seen God move because you've waited and you're on the other side of that now that a waiting period has happened? I think that is one of the best things we as group members can encourage each other in, because y'all live different lives, right? And for us to pour into the lives around us because we see things differently, speak it, right? Testify about how God has been faithful even in the times of waiting. All right, groups, as always, wrap up with prayer today and then jump into the digging deeper section. I hope that as we start pointing to the Gospels and as we start looking closer at the story of Jesus, that you're encouraged and we see the fruit of spending time in the Old Testament come to fruition now that we're jumping into the New Testament. I cannot wait for this series and for our new year ahead. So I hope this is encouraging to you, groups. Have a great week, and we will talk to you soon.